That did it.
Anyway, okay, so yeah.
Was on a couple panels yesterday, and I'll just steal what they did. The way that we started was just kind of introducing ourselves, and then typically conversation runs from there. So I assume you guys know these guys, but we'll.
I don't think you'll have any trouble getting Cory and I
to talk. I mean, I'm not. No comment. Um, but yeah, so I'm Brent Miller. I am an independent author. I've published 14 books so far, and the the topic of seat of your pants writing is kind of how I do things. And the reason I signed up for this panel is because this is a 4-book series and this is a 5-book series. So, none of it's done with an outline. So that's why I'm here. Hopefully, I can give some insight into the topic if you have questions. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
I'm Jim Doty. I write and publish science fiction and fantasy under my initials, JL Doty. I have about 20 published novels, mixture of traditionally published with HarperCollins and Open Road Media, and self-published. But I will admit I've been far more successful self-publishing.
I'm Cory Doctorow. I write mostly science fiction novels, but lots of other things too, YA, middle grades, picture book for little kids, lots of nonfiction on various subjects. I've written about 30 books, and I am sometimes instructor and board member at Clarion, and also Clarion West and Bible Paradise, where I sometimes talk to people about how to plot a book as a pantser.
So the three of us are pantsers, right?
That's the
premise.
Yeah, that's the premise.
Yeah, this is the pantsers panel.
Are you a pantser?
I am indeed. So yeah, I and the most kind of egregious example of this, I guess, during lockdown, I write when I'm anxious. So I climbed into my backyard hammock during lockdown. I wrote 9 books. It was a very busy time for me, and one of them was a book that I wrote very quickly, about 6 weeks flat, called Red Team Blues. And the conceit was, what if you wrote the final volume of a beloved long-running series without bothering with the tedious business of writing the series? Right. So the last adventure of a kind of roguish hero who you kind of approach him in the prose as though the reader is familiar with his long and storied career, but you don't bother writing the other ones. And it was pretty successful. I sent it to my editor, Patrick, who was on some panels yesterday. You may have met him. I love Patrick very much. I've known him since I was a tadpole. We met on a BPS in the 80s when I was a teenager. He's published all my novels.
Is he no longer the
He is. No, he just lives out here now. He moved out during the lockdown. His mom went into a home and he came out to close up her house and was like, why do I live in Brooklyn? And so just stayed. But Patrick, as much as I love him, will admit to you that he's not the world's most reliable correspondent. And so when I wrote this book, I thought it would be some months before I heard back from him. And instead, I got an email the next morning that was just 3 lines. That was a fucking ride. Whoa. And that was very nice. But then he called my agent and bought 3 of them. And the problem was it was the final adventure of this character. And I kind of moped and tried to figure out what to do about this. I had this idea that, Arthur Conan Doyle had brought Sherlock Holmes out of retirement, but that was because Queen Victoria promised him a knighthood. And Patrick was at the time a vice president of the Macmillan Corporation, a very powerful man in New York publishing, but could not knight me. And so I didn't want to do that. I really liked the character. I kind of felt like he'd earned his retirement by the time I finished the book. And then I realized that you don't have to publish them in order. And that while there is sort of a mild tightening down of the tension, if you know that there's another book that comes after this one, you know that the character can't possibly die. Right? At the very least, that's off the table. But that's broadly speaking off the table in series fiction too. If you're reading a long-running series and the protagonist of the series dies in the book, you'll know it before you pick up the book. Book 7, Harry died. Everyone would know before book 7 came out. It'd be impossible to keep that a secret. So it wasn't much of a reduction in tension. And then I realized that if you write these books out of sequence, you get all kinds of dividends because you're not foreshadowing, you're backshadowing. Which means that the more shit you make up, the more of a premeditated motherfucker you appear to be. It's like the opposite. So, the protagonist is a 67-year-old forensic accountant who specializes in unwinding finance scams in Silicon Valley. He's been there since the birth of the PC, and his last adventure is, of course, a cryptocurrency hustle. And he's a kind of zealot of finance crime in Silicon Valley. And I realized I could take any time at which there was a scammy tech bubble, which is the entire history of Silicon Valley, and stick them in the middle of it. So I wrote 3. The third one's coming out in January. The last one came out last February. Or no, the third one's coming out in February. The last one came out last February. It's called The Bezel. Next one's called Picks and Shovels. But I have 2 more on the drawing board. And while those 3 go back in time, I have 2 more that are just randomly interspersed in his career. And it's been a very productive way of thinking about this kind of plotting.
So I'm an extreme pantser, and that sometimes right now I'm working on a new book, and I have a character, and I go through this period where my productivity is maybe a paragraph a week, because writer doesn't have writer's block, but writer sits down and hasn't prepared to write syndrome, but it starts to evolve, and I have this thing where I don't know who the characters are until I've seen them react, and I have to write something and see how they react to situations, and I end up writing, eventually kind of trickling out 20 or 30,000 words that most of it's going to be thrown away, when I really start editing seriously, and then I kind of have something going, and at that point I probably got a beginning and an end, and now I have to figure out how to get from step 1 to step 30, and but at that point, then I'll sit down and I'll write a book in about 3 or 4 months. I'll write a 120,000 word book in about 3 or 4 months. I binge write. Karen is, God damn it, Jim! I told you dinner's ready, and I'm just, I'm typing away, and I really have to pee. One more sentence. And now I really gotta pee really bad. One more sentence, and I finally come out of my office, and I'm racing across the living room, and Karen's like, Jim, and then so I get a book out, and then I sit down to write the next book, and it's, oh my God, how the fuck am I going to write another 120,000 words, because I have no idea what the second book is about, but somehow I manage.
You have a question?
Pardon me?
I was saying we have a question.
When you're sitting there thinking just a couple of sentences, is the reason that you want to not go to the bathroom and
because I'm going. At that point, I'm going. That's not when I'm sitting there at the very beginning. It's like I'll take the time, but once I get going, I binge write, and I'm an early riser. I haven't set an alarm in 20 years, 30 years, and I'm usually up at 5:30. Sleeping in for me is 6, and so I get up, and I'm still when I get going. I'm at 5, 6 at night. I'm still cranking away. But like I say, my output for the first month or so is almost non-existent. And once I get going, I'm just cranking.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same way that, like for me, when I start writing, I tend to go like by the chapter. I make sure I do a chapter every day, and so I'll start the chapter. I'm like, okay, where was I going? What was the point? And then halfway through, I'm gone and I'm dead to the world. I'm like this has to be finished, and it's this cycle. Every chapter of every book for me is like, where do I start? And then I'm obsessively writing, and then I just stare at a blank page again. Yeah.
So do you binge write?
Yeah. I mean, so I try to write I have to schedule it for myself. I try to do a chapter a week, but that means one day of the week I sit and write 4 to 5 thousand words basically, and then I do that at least once a week. But I mean, my family can attest. When I was finishing Faultless, my most recent book, um, that one chapter a week became three real quick. You know, um,
I think that there's maybe a way to synthesize the different views here is to talk a little about how weird it is that fiction actually captures our interest, because there's something odd about the fact that you have sort of involuntary limbic response to made up stuff as a reader, right? You are, like the most tragic death in literature didn't matter because it didn't happen, right? Romeo and Juliet mattered less than the yogurt you ate for breakfast because that yogurt was alive and now it's dead. Whereas Romeo and Juliet never lived, never died, and by definition can't matter. And I think what happens is that, in our world, the way we experience empathy and concern and so on, is that we model other people. We sort of involuntarily, automatically spin up these models of other people that are in our lives. When we hear someone's been hurt, we sort of subject the model to the same hurt and ask the model how it feels, and that's how we understand how they feel, and so on. And I think that writing is just a way of kind of tapping into that. Both as a writer, so as you say, once you know what the characters are going to do, I think what you've done is you've kind of spun up a model of the character. And in the same way that you can ask yourself what your mom would think of the state of your room, you can ask yourself what a character would do in a situation.
But it's more than that. It's they kind of become real people to me.
Yeah.
And hopefully that's the way they will be to the reader. And at that point, I get to the point where I don't have to constantly ask myself, how will they
Sure.
react? And that makes the writing more comfortable because they react. There's a person inside me that is going to tell me how they will react. And
Yeah, I think that's sort of what I'm trying to get at. And for me, one of the things that's really killed work that I've done in progress is I find that as I go through a book, I get more and more anxious that I am, because there's so much of this that's sort of received without actual conscious planning, that probably you're messing it up. The continuity is out, they've screwed up the character and so on. And I get this overwhelming temptation that I must resist to go back, reread the work and refactor it, to rationalize it. And I find that when I do that, what I've done is I've very forcibly reminded myself that these characters that have been acting like fully fledged people in my head are in fact a puppet show I'm putting on for myself. Let's go on a quest. That sounds great. Here we go. And then the characters stop telling me what they're going to do, and you have to go back through that tedious process of convincing yourself that you're not just breathing your own farts, right? That you're not like inhaling the output of your own imagination and pretending that it's real.
I'm perfectly happy breathing my own farts. I do that really well.
Yeah.
I would.
No, I don't have that problem. I think once they become alive, I'm just comfortable when they move.
Yeah, I just want to go back really quick to something you said about them not being real, so inherently can't matter. But I think it's the opposite. I mean, fiction imitates reality, and our brains. This is a psychology nerd thing, but um, if we talk about our goals and our dreams, we get the same response in our brain as if we accomplish those goals and dreams. So our brain doesn't care what's real, what matters, right? So these characters are real to us and our readers, and what they go through reflects our world in such a way that can spark real change. Right?
Well, I think you're right in that it can make people experience emotions or have a kind of emotional architectural fly through of what an imaginary future might be. But in a very important material way, imaginary people, the things that happen to imaginary people don't matter, right? In the sense that if you murder a person, there is a moral consequence to it. If you murder a character, the moral consequence is completely different, and I wouldn't even call it a moral consequence. You might call it an aesthetic or an artistic consequence, but no one is a murderer for having killed a character. You are a murderer if you kill the reader.
Well, but
I think they do matter, in that in a secondary fashion, if you do it right, the character doesn't matter, but the influence you have on the reader matters a great deal.
Sure.
You know.
But the question I'm trying to get at here is, why does this influence a person, right? Why would a person who knows intellectually that, in the same way that, you know, if you've ever done the VR thing where you wear the headset and you walk across a plank and it seems like you're stepping out across the Empire State Building, and there's an intellectual part of your mind that knows that you're just standing on a rug, but there's a part of your body that is very convinced that you are standing over a precipice. And in the same way, there's something very curious going on when intellectually you know that these are things that didn't happen, right? The sorrow someone feels does not reflect the thing that is actually sorrowful. It's just a made up story, and yet you feel it. Where does that come from? I think it comes from this idea that you can invoke the empathy response in the same way that you can invoke the vertigo response, right? And that, you know, in the same way that you definitely can't fall off the plank in the VR headset and hurt yourself, you also, no one gets hurt in a narrative killing. You can experience the emotion, but the consequence doesn't exist, right? The consequence is the consequence of having experienced the emotion.
I killed off a main character, and boy, did I get shit from some readers. So I heard them. They were pissed. You know, there was a couple that were pissed.
Yeah, and that's like, I feel that emotion and fantasy like are so interwoven, and I mean, most of the things that we remember happening didn't happen.
Sure.
Right? So there's a very fine line, I think, between reality and our perception.
Yeah.
And I know, you know, if you perceive, like, if you're immersed in especially a series, you're reading 700,000 words of, you know, and this character becomes your friend, especially to people who maybe isolate in reading for one reason or another. And, you know, so the emotional consequences that they feel could be just as real as something.
I agree. So yeah, just to be clear, I'm not saying that the emotional consequences are. I'm saying the curious thing is that you have real emotional consequences from events that don't really happen.
And I see your point, and I agree, even though I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, you know. But I'm having trouble making it matter to me, and I think that, you know, it's like my emotional response to reading really good fiction can be so powerful that I can't intellectually take the concept you're describing and have it influence me in any way.
Let me try and connect the dots from that to pantsing, because I have a theory about this, which is that if you stipulate that at least one of the ways in which an aesthetic reaction is evinced by narrative fiction is that you convince someone that an imaginary person, that the unconsequential things that happen to imaginary people matter in a subconscious and irresistible way, then a lot of what boils down to storytelling is just not forcibly reminding the reader that they're reading, that you're putting on a puppet show for them. And, you know, when you look at some of the kind of gimmicks for plotting, so Aldous Budrus used to teach this thing called the 7-point plot outline. You start with a person in a place with a problem who tries intelligently to solve their problem, fails through no fault of their own, such that things get worse, which gives them a new problem, which creates escalating stakes. You do that until you reach a place where the stakes can't get any higher. That's the climax. And then you have a denouement in which they've either succeeded or failed, and that's tragedy or comedy. And when you break that down, what you're actually doing in that pantsing method, because it's a pantsing method, right? You don't need to, all you need to do at each juncture as you're writing is ask yourself, what problem is this character trying to solve? How will they fail intelligently through no fault of their own? How will the stakes go up? And you can just keep doing that, and eventually you'll reach a point where you can't raise the stakes any higher, and you will have found your climax. What you're doing is you're starting with a person in a place with a problem, because all real people have names. They're in places. And then the problem evinces this curiosity from the reader. And the cyclic torture of things get worse, fail, things get worse, fail, is a way to just crank up that empathy reaction. And what we call rising tension can be thought of as just a deliberate extraction of that kind of limbic response from the reader in order to create that aesthetic effect that is at the root of the novel or the root of narrative itself.
So you triggered a thought, and I was thinking. So you start with a person, and then you've got a place, and they've got to have a problem. And I think that's why I pants, because I might start with a person, and I need to know that person a little bit better to understand what kind of problem is really going to be a problem for them.
Yeah, right.
You know, Elon Musk losing $1 million is not a problem. Losing $1 billion is not a problem. It is because he wants to make even more, but it's not a problem for him, you know. And so you get to know this character, and now what's really going to be a problem for this person, you know. And and that was just the thought you triggered. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. I had not heard of the
7-point plot outline. It's Aldous Buttress's old saw. It's, you know, it's a mainstay of things like Writers of the Future and Clarion and a lot of
it's one step
books.
It's one step away from Boy Meets Girl and Boy Gets Girl, Boy Loses Girl, Boy Gets Girl back, or doesn't, and then you have the tragedy. You know?
The Story Circle, Dan Harmon, you know, is another. But clearly, I'm stepping in as the de facto moderator. This is your fault, guys. But we are very interested in this topic. But I know I saw a couple hands up over here and then back here, so take some questions.
One point I was going to make earlier was it sounds a little bit like in building the characters in your mind, you're sort of exploiting homunculus theory.
Sure.
The idea that we don't actually know anybody and we're all relating to the characters of the people around us in our minds.
Yeah, I went to summer camp with a kid who had had major Gremel seizures all his life. He died quite young, but at one point in a bid to try and prevent the seizures from spreading, they severed his corpus callosum. And afterwards, if he looked at something with one eye, he could tell you what it was, but not what it was called. And if he looked at it with the other eye, he could tell you what it's called, but not what it was. But when he spoke it aloud, he created like a free space acoustic link to replace the high-speed electrical link between the two lobes of his brain, and he knew what it was and what it was for. So he could say, "Oh, that's a thing that you use to flip pancakes," and then as he said it, he would say it's a spatula, because his ears were replacing the bus. And I think that when you write, there's something going on where you are looking at the words on the page and you're reading them as you're writing them. And the part of your brain that just processes input and turns that into models of people is just automatically doing this. You're creating a kind of free space optical link between parts of your mind that don't normally talk to each other.
Yeah, I think that's it. Kind of goes back to something I was like alluding to, I think, but like you said, I have not heard of homunculus theory entirely, right? But the understanding that I have would be we know people and events kind of how we perceive them. Everything is our perception, and so it kind of goes back to every memory we have, every interaction we've had with a person. I mean, how many times do we think, "Oh, that person probably hates me," right? That they're thinking this. You know what they're thinking, right? But I think that it really does. It's not that much different to me, like you said. Like I see my characters the same way my brain sees other people, right? Um,
Yeah, I think one of the other aesthetic impacts of fiction, particularly of written fiction, is the illusion that you can have access to someone else's interiority, which is a thing that no one in the history of the human race has ever had. You know, in that sense, like Jane Austen is a science fiction writer because she's pretending telepathy exists, just like as far as we know, a thing that doesn't. And it's one of the reasons that prose to film is so fraught, because the way that you make a bad film is by having people narrate rather than imply their interiority. The person who says "I am angry at you" is a bad actor, but the writer who says "I felt angry at him" is a good writer. And so much of that translation is about taking something that is entirely explicit and making it implicit.
Go ahead.
So with the passing method, how do you make sure that you don't keep yourself in the corner? That you just, the way you make it sound is that you're just like, okay, I know where I'm going more or less, so I'm just taking a path there, but I'm not really say in terms of details. So how do you know that you're not going to end up doing something in chapter two that you're going to regret in chapter five? I might have to go back and change this, and then once you do that, then you have to change that, and so on.
I paint myself into a corner
Yeah,
all the time.
that's what I was gonna say. I don't know that I won't do that. In this series, I finished. It was a trilogy, and I was going through, edited the first two, and then I got to the third one, and I'm like, this doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah.
And I rewrote the third book.
Yeah.
You know,
One of the weird things about writing is how much you end up carrying in your head without knowing it.
Yeah.
When I lived in the Bay Area in the early 2000s, my parents came for a visit, and we went out and stayed at a B&B in wine country, and I couldn't sleep, and I wrote like 8,000 words, and then went to bed, and then left it on my hard drive, and I got stuck on another novel, and I decided I'd go back and revisit this book, and I was like, oh yeah, this is quite good, and so I started. My normal method is a page a day, so I started writing my page a day, and about a year later, it was winding up. And I realized as I was coming into the home stretch that the climax was not the climax that I've been thinking of. The climax I've been thinking about just absolutely couldn't work. And so I kind of moped and I walked around for a couple of weeks and I figured it out and I wrote that climax. And I printed out the manuscript. It was a big book. It's a book called Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town. And I printed it out and I turned it over and I looked at that first page that I'd written in a hotel room 3 years before, thinking I was going to have to rewrite the whole book to make it line up with this ending I'd come up with. And I had foreshadowed the ending on the first page.
Yeah.
And hadn't known it until years later.
So I almost always I find myself doing this. I'll get to about 30,000 words, and then part of my writing process is I'm constantly going back. You know, I edge it forward and I go back and reread. I must read the novel 20 times by the time I get done doing it, not counting the final proofreads. But I'll get to about 30,000 words, and then there'll just kind of be an instinctive moment where I'll stop and I'll go back and I'll start reading through it. And without advancing the plot any further, after about 2 weeks of doing that, I will have added it, thrown out 10,000 words and added another 30,000, and I'll advance the word count to about 50,000 words without having advanced the plot, because I've got corners that I've painted myself into. I've got holes that I've done. You know, it's a horrible, horrible story. At that point, the first half of the novel is a horrible, horrible story, and I go in and clean it up. And then that happens in the second half of the novel. And recently, I was all done, and then I went back, and in the final proofread, wait a minute. This part in chapter 7 comes after this part in chapter 30. Oh, fuck. Yeah. You know, and I had to do, so that's the price I pay for being a pantser, but I wouldn't do it any other way.
I find it really interesting. Like you were saying, where there are tons of holes to fill in as you go back. I'll be writing, and there are times that, you know, I'll finish the book, and I'm like, this would be really good if I foreshadowed it. And so then I go through, and my process is not as like as long as a lot of authors. I write it, and then I edit it once, and I have my, like content editors and stuff, but they're all related to me. Anyway, so when I'm going back through to edit, I'll add in foreshadowing for later things. But something I find funny is, because I'm not married to this outline, I have the ability as I'm writing to pivot, right? And so I'll write something in chapter 4 just because it came up. The characters were interacting a certain way, and I'm like, I don't know why or what, but this is foreshadowing something. So then I'll keep going and I'll make it foreshadow something, right?
One kind of seeming contradiction, or maybe counterintuitive thing, is that when you have a simple, relatively mechanical structure, because it's easy to hew to, it opens a lot of space for improvisation without losing track of it. So if you think about, 1-4-5 blues jam, right? That's a very straightforward 12-bar sequence that every blues song you heard is ba ba da da dum ba bum ba bum. And you think about how many variations you've heard on that, and how much improvisation you can get within that framework. And so I grew up in Toronto, and like a lot of cities, it's built around a body of water, Lake Ontario, and it's at the lake is at the south end of the city, and the whole city flows downhill towards the lake, which means that even if you don't really know where you are, if you're headed downhill, you're broadly speaking going south. Not always, right? There are local maxima. And so, in the same way, if you're trying to ascend a gradient towards a climax where the stakes can't get any higher, so long as the stakes are going up, you're ascending towards that gradient, that apex rather. But this can also fail you where you have more complicated terrain. So when I moved to London, London's built on 7 buried rivers and one that's not, the Thames. And as a result, the uphill and downhill don't correspond towards the Thames estuary, because it's actually a series of valleys within London that go to it. And so I found that this heuristic completely confounded me. And so while, if you think about this, kind of going back to a musical metaphor, that kind of improvisation that you get in a 145 12-bar blues is something that requires that very simplistic backbone. There are other improvisational models, but they use much more complex backbones, and the people involved have to practice a lot more, right? That with each other, that there's a lot less room for collaboration. That's spontaneous. It has to be a lot more premeditated. And I think that maybe one of the kind of overarching themes of pantsers versus plotters is pantsers, I think, perforce have less complex heuristics, because that gives you the space in which to improvise without having to have a lot of headroom involved in tracking, this complicated thing that you're doing. And then maybe you can go back and fix it mechanically in the end, in the same way that, once you've got a good jam, you can go into the studio and record it. I was thinking, as you were talking about something Joe Haldeman once told a group of students when we were teaching together, which is that when he's finished a book, he goes back, he writes longhand, and on every page in the notebook, he manually inserts a sensory detail, which sounds like the most mechanical, trite way of doing it. And yet, he's quite a lavish, kind of sensuous writer, and he achieves it through this very mechanical means.
I think it's interesting how mechanical it can be. Like whether you're a plot. I don't. I'm really bad with words. Plotter or pantser, right? Whatever approach you take, or somewhere in the middle, right? There, people think that you're just wildly improvisational, or um, you know, really to the
Premeditated.
yeah premeditated. Thank you. Or, but like either way, there are these things that you throw in, and it's like, okay, I'm gonna make sure to describe this to have this type of theme, and it doesn't come across right, because they don't nobody knows what's going on in your head when you're writing, so you put this stuff in, and it just looks like you um,
So, so in fact, all three of us are describing a process in which we do get really mechanical and we plot, and but the I think I know I separate the two. The kind of binge writing is really thrilling for me, and then having to go back and carefully edit and think about plot and just mundane issues of is this scene boring? Have I gotten too boring for too long? I need to thrill things up a little bit, maybe. All right, we all get and we all have to do that. I don't think you can write a novel without getting into plotting and doing the mechanical things. But I think our approach to getting to the mechanical stuff is different. I know of one writer, and I don't know that I have never had this confirmed, but I'm told that Tim Powers is the extreme version of a plotter. That he writes and I haven't had this confirmed. I'd like to.
I can tell you what Tim's method is. I've had him describe it.
Oh, well, please. I had heard that he writes a detailed outline in advance and then carefully follows it,
Yeah.
and then will not deviate from that.
So the crux of his method, because he writes secret histories, kind of conspiratorial novels, is he takes two unrelated persons or events, and he tracks. He writes a time and place grid for each of them. So like, this is where this person was. This is what they were doing. This is when they were doing it. And anytime he finds a correspondence, right? Two people were in the same place. Two people were doing the same thing. Two people were active at the same time. His method is to assume that it wasn't a coincidence. And his narrative glue is to write how it's basically how QAnon works, right? Except he knows he's making it up and they don't. It's a.
I think some of them do know they're making it
I
up,
think
but they don't give a shit.
It's a very powerful method. I've often thought about using it because it's a very exciting method. Kind of taps into our apophenia.
Really cool.
Yeah, Powers is a great guy. I mean, he was Philip K. Dick's protege, and it shows, you know.
That is cool. That is really cool. But yeah, my point is, we just because we're pantsers doesn't mean we don't get mechanical and plot.
I think that it goes the same for most plotters too. Like some people, I'm sure, stick to really tough outlines, but that's why like I don't like the plotters versus pantsers discussion that I see a lot, because it's like it puts you into these buckets and assumes that there are two buckets. But as many authors as there are buckets.
It's a spectrum and not a binary.
Pretty much.
I'm the they them of plotting.
But you know, we're subject to all those things. You've all heard the thing, if you want to write, you should write 1,000 words a day, you know. And that's an example of a really horrible way of illustrating something. You know, if you've got a day job, you're not going to write 1,000 words a day. I remember trying to do that.
Yeah.
You know, when I was starting my career, and I had a day job and I was working 12 hours a day, and I get home and I was too tired. But I found a way to manage to write several thousand words every quarter. You know, and you know, without doing 1,000 words a day. And so we have all these cliches and these puns that you know, like plotters versus pantsers, but they're all a big spectrum.
I think it's also horses for courses. So I am a daily writer, and for me, I always feel like the best advice that I didn't follow until far too long was to write every day. It doesn't have to be 1,000 words. I've had at various times in my life really demanding day jobs, and it's been as little as 250, which is a page, which is a novel every year. But for me, the thing that you get with a page a day is the habit. And it just happens it's like brushing your teeth. Before you know it, it's done. And it happens wherever you are and under whatever circumstances.
So in an odd way, I did write every day. Mm-hmm. But what I did was I was commuting up the San Diego freeway. I had a 45-minute drive one way. And you know, you're on autopilot. I've driven this thing every day. And my mind would be working out dialogue and things like that and stuff like that. I'd get to work and I'd stop and I'd write little notes on Post-it. And then on the way home, I'd do the same thing. And I'd be practicing dialogue, thinking it through on autopilot. I get home and I write little Post-it notes. Yeah. And so I didn't crank out 1,000 words a day, but then on the weekend, my wife likes to sleep in. I'm an early riser. I'd get up and I'd have 3 hours where I would crank out stuff. And then sometimes I was traveling and I couldn't, but you know, I wrote over a period of 30 years with a demanding day job, sometimes flying around the world 15 times a year. I wrote 6 full-length novels, you know, by just kind of, I think the only thing I ever did right was when I finished, I had a rule. When I finished a novel, I was not allowed to submit it anywhere until I'd written the first chapter of the next thing I was going to write.
I have a stupid writer trick, which is if you finish in the middle of a sentence, you get 3 words for free the next day. And that often primes your pump. Teresa, who was here yesterday, when I told her about this, she said, yes, this is why when you're knitting, you leave a piece of yarn loose so that you can find where to pick up the next day. And I would sometimes get too excited and really enjoy where I'm going and finish on a smooth surface and find myself somewhat stymied the next day. And about 15 years into this, I realized, you can just delete the last 3 words and rewrite them. You know, very weird how myopic these. I mean, this is the thing about something becoming habitual, is that it ceases to be something you interrogate actively, which is why it's advantageous to make it habitual, because it's just a thing that happens automatically. But then you miss out on some of those incremental improvements that you can make through continuous assessment and introspection.
Yeah.
But you know, that just triggered me to be anxious to get up in the morning on Saturday because I had all these things that I wanted to actually write. Yeah. So sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, we have a couple more questions. So it's just.
So what I was hearing, I thought, was that improvising instead of having a full pretense outline happens partially by putting in little tricks, essential details, whatever, that will help the readers to feel as if it's the same. And yet, I think that's what Cory was saying about how empathy works. I was thinking, well, if I have theory, autistic people will never have an emotional response to the characters in a book. And I was wondering, do you notice this in your fandoms that the improvisation amount of readers are disproportionately not autistic compared to some other authors?
So,
I don't know how I would estimate the proportion of other authors' fans who are neurotypical or neuroatypical, and not being on the spectrum. I don't know that I'm qualified to opine on the experience of literature if you are. I know people on the spectrum who say that the kind of caricature of being on the spectrum, that you have no theory of mind of others, grossly overstated and not really reflective. And so I don't know. I guess is my answer.
yeah, I think that was a good summary, and I this by the same logic, I don't feel like qualified to make a broad statement, but from the friends that I have who've read my work, um, they like they don't express to me at least of distance from the character, and I think it might help. And again, I I don't want to make any broad statements because I don't want to be ignorant, but it might help that what we were talking about earlier with with books are very explicit and the characters tell you how they're feeling. And so at least with, the autistic friends that I have, the trouble comes in with that implicit, like how am I supposed to know that you're hurting or that you're sad or, with this situation. And it, in a book they kind of tell you. So I think it kind of helps bridge that gap. Um, but again, that's coming from somebody who doesn't experience the world that way. So okay, we've got 1, 2, 3. So yes, question.
So, catch your rate is way more by the seat of your pants typically. When you get to the end of the book, how complete is it? And for each of you, is it draft? Do you really got to go back and polish? Is it almost done? How do you edit? What's each of your processes to edit that way?
You guys want to take that first?
I have a very specific process. I get to the end of the book. So this is after I've proofread it and found that major error that needs correcting, and then I've gone in and corrected it, and now I'm satisfied. And I have a list of all the things that I do wrong. And some of it is as mundane as homonyms. I know the difference between lightning and lightening, but I'm writing away.
Yeah.
But some of it is searching out passive verbs, searching out the word could. So I'll go through this list. That'll take me 2 or 3 days. It's really boring and mundane stuff. Then I'll do another proofread. Then I have a team of beta readers that I've slowly acquired over a period of about 10 years. I was like a predator. You don't, someone writes and says, I really enjoyed this. And you write back and say, yeah, and you develop a conversation with them. And you don't tell them that you're thinking of having them as a beta reader because you might not want to. But slowly, I kind of learn if they might be a good, and I've got just this team of beta readers that 2 of them I'd pay thousands of dollars for as content editors. editors, and I'm never going to tell them that because they might start charging me. So then and a couple of them are really good copy editors, and I'll go through about a 3-4 week month process with them, and then at that point maybe I have to do some major rewrites or maybe not, and that might mean I might have to go back to my beta reader. So that's a process I've worked out. So, but I used to use work with some very professional content editors, but I can't afford to pay $3,000 per novel for that, and so I eventually replaced them with some very good and very well vetted beta.
Yeah, I mean, it's a multi-stage process. So as I write, one of the things that I try to focus on is not avoiding things that I call writing-related program activity, which is things that are kind of writing adjacent, like getting into a Wikipedia click trans, looking up a minor fact in order to get a plot point right. And so I make very liberal use of two abbreviations, TK, which is to come, and FCK, which is fact check. And so FCK might even be something like, what was that minor character's name? I might not remember. And so I'll put a placeholder name in and leave myself a note. And so there's about a day when I'm finished the manuscript of going back and fixing those. And again, this is one of those things where the unconscious feeling about those.
I'm going to steal that from
you. Should.
I like that idea. I like that.
The unconscious feeling of those is far in excess of the reality. So by the time I finish the book, I feel this crushing weight of what feels like thousands of queries that will take me months to resolve, and it's rarely more than a couple of hours, maybe a full day's work to go through that. There's a bunch of steps, the stages that go through in parallel, me editing and my editor editing. I try to read aloud the work. That is I think a really powerful way to spot the language gonks. I don't always get a chance to do it. I have been reading some of my own audiobooks, which is great, but it makes me wish that I could make these corrections because it's always after the manuscript is finished. And I do often spot little things that I'd like to fix when I'm reading the audio aloud. I once hand copied a digital manuscript onto paper, and it was the same thing, right? It's a really powerful way to slow down and look at it in a new way. In the same way that like walking down a street that you normally drive down gives you a completely different view of that street. Hand copying was a really powerful method. I just don't have the time. I wish I did. There is a thematic edit that I always try to make. So with my first novel, Patrick had this incredibly good piece of feedback, which he professes not to remember, but which has been my North Star, which is that in a science fiction novel, you have a world and a character, and the world is a macrocosm of the character, and the character is a microcosm of the world. And one way to think about a science fiction novel is that the character makes their perambulations running around and around until they've rotated the world one full revolution, and you've seen the world in its entirety through the character's travails. And that when a book falls off the rails in some way, it's because the teeth aren't meshing. And so I will often go through and do a thematic pass where I try to sharpen up the correspondences between the character and their adventures and the world as I was thinking about it, and whatever point I was trying to make with the world, or whatever ideas I had about the world. And then there's the normal proofing, copy editing stuff. Again, those things tend to loom larger than they really are. So, the copy editor will catch a continuity problem. And when I first see it in the editorial note, I'll be like, oh shit, that's going to take forever to fix. And then it just turns out to be really straightforward. My secret weapon is that my mother is the world's greatest proofer. And with every single book has caught multiple significant typos that the proofer and the copy editor and I all missed. God love her. And she's old but sharp. And as I think about my career in the decades to come, I really feel like there's going to be a break between novels that my mom could work on and novels that she couldn't, which will come someday in the future.
Jerry Purnell once told me that after all the content editing at his peak, his publisher gave him 3 copy editors, and it was a recognition that even a professional copy editor can't catch all your mistakes.
Yeah.
And they would copy edit, the three editors would copy edit his work in serial. One would edit it and send the edits to Jerry. He'd then send it to the second editor. They'd edit it,
Yeah.
and etc. And they don't do that anymore. But I think it's a good statement of how they used to value, and I'm sure they still do. They just can't afford, the price of three copies.
I'll run through my process real quick. Just it's shorter than than theirs. I write the book by the time I'm done because I'm very meticulous when I'm writing. I can't stand to go back. So when I write a chapter, it's something that I'm pretty happy with. And when I finish the book, there is some stuff to change, obviously, but once I finish it, I send it to my family, and I've been blessed with an incredible family who is both intelligent and willing to help me. So I have content copy editors within my circle. I talk about my books a lot with them, so I get the back and forth. And then once they're done, I do a final pass, and that's really my process. So it's a lot. It's a lot shorter, but my writing is long because I can't churn out 10,000 words in a week because they need to all be good words, right? But anyway, yeah, we have a couple more minutes, so I want to do kind of a speed round of questions. I saw a lot of hands, so.
Yeah, so have any of you ever written your chapters or your parts of the book out of sequence rather than going linearly?
Yeah.
The idea would be, okay, I have an overall idea what needs to happen here, and I really can envision this particular scene. So let me just jump and write that scene, and then I'm going to need this scene over here, and
Yeah.
Just sometimes like movies I've heard like people write about sequence or definitely shoot them up.
Yeah, I've done that personally. If I'm feeling inspired to write a certain scene, but if you jump around too much, again with the process I just described, it makes it really hard to keep it straight. So then I'll have to go back more and have more continuity edits because my characters change a lot over the book. So if I write chapter 6 and then chapter 20 and then chapter 7, I have to write a different person each time. So I find that to be highly difficult, but I'll do it if a chapter is not working well in my head.
I've beat out a couple of series for writers' rooms where that's the only way you do it. You're all throwing stuff. You got a Miro board and you're sticking post-it notes on it and you're figuring out sequences and moving stuff around. And I think that works well in that kind of collaborative environment. In my own life, not so much, but you reminded me of a story Damon Knight told me where he had an idea for a novel, but not the whole novel, just these great set pieces that were really exciting. And so he wrote all the set pieces thinking that he would then write the boring glue that went between them. And it was, in the days of TypeScript. So he takes his typed manuscript and he lays it out on the carpet thinking he would then start to write the glue that went between. And he realized at that point that good books don't have boring stuff in them. And he was done, which I thought was a very inspirational story.
I'll sometimes do that, but rarely. Most upon occasion, so frequently I know the beginning and I know the end, and that's kind of when I start I'm really writing the book. And sometimes I'll stop and think about the final scene, and I might go and I'll write a rough draft of the final scene. But by the time I've finished writing the rest of the book, that scene is going to change so much that it's not worth polishing. It's not worth doing anything more than I've got a few thoughts and I'll get them down on paper right now to see if they survive the rest of the book.
Question?
I was going to ask you guys, or if you've ever caught yourselves building up maybe a side character or subplot that you had planned for that you never paid off for.
Yeah. I know that this question is directed at me, so I'll just answer it quickly and then give it to you guys. But Cursed, the main character started as Garrick. I ended up loving the side character so much that I now say he's the main character and Garrick is the hero of the story. So it kind of gives this interesting dichotomy where the hero is not the main character. But yeah, he was supposed to be the friend, and his story just resonated more with me than the real, the main one. What about you guys? This is probably our last question. Just so we'll each answer. We'll give our closing. Right.
Yeah.
But so feel free to come up to us after um, and talk. But
Yeah,
I suppose that's it.
Vacate.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming down.